Watching the horse walk from behind, we can see more of his barrel to the left, and then we can see the right forelimb through the hind limbs. So we know that his body is bent to the right side. The right side of his pelvis seems dropped, and it doesn't lift at the same height as the left side. And his tail is to the left, and it doesn't swish equally on both sides. It mostly swishes to the left side. Also, as he walks, the pelvis has to swing to the right to protract his right hind limb. His hips and stifles are externally rotated. We can see them on each side as he moves. We can see the stifle pointing out, and also we can see the hocks pointing in and the distal limbs turned out. Because of this external rotation of the hips, hooves follow an arc, and they make this dishing movement through their arc of motion. And the left hind always lands towards the midline because of the inability of the right side of the pelvis to keep the left side at the same height during the swing phase of the left hind limb. And this is because the gluteal muscles on the right side are atrophic and they cannot support the weight of the pelvis. So what we see is not the right side of the pelvis going higher, rather it's the left side dropping lower because of the atrophic gluteals on the right side. Also, we can see that there is accessory movement of the hocks, and also because both hind limbs land towards the midline, they land with the lateral part of the hoof. The horse has an antalgic gait, and he has to spend less time weight bearing on the right hind limb and hurries the left hind limb, which lands with more concussion on the ground. Observing the horse from the left side gives us the impression that he's leaning forward to offload the hind limbs, and most of his weight is carried through his forelimbs. He's carrying his neck and head too low to help with that, and we can see the right side bending throughout his body and his neck. We can also see that the spine behind his withers, the caudal thoracic spine and the lumbar spine, doesn't move in the sagittal plane. It rather makes side bending and rotational movements to accommodate the movement transmitted by the hind limbs. And we can almost see that this weakness, this muscular weakness on the right side, doesn't affect only the pelvis, it affects the whole spine, because when the horse is supporting his weight with his left-sided limbs, then we can see the right side almost drop, and the spine's processes of the spine move to the right. Thus, the vertebrae rotate to the left. So regarding the spine, we would talk about an extension, right side bending, and left rotation deformity, but then we'll confirm all that when we see the horse from the other side. The lumbar spine is also in extension, and um, there's an angle between the lumbar spine and the pelvis, and the movement is a combination of side bending and rotation, which swings the pelvis to the right. And the movement of the hind limbs follows what we've already discussed. So the right hind seems to be taking longer strides, not because it's the good hind limb, but precisely because it's the hind limb that can't afford to support the weight as long for the left hind to move equally. The left hind, though, shows good bending of the joints of the stifle and the hock during protraction of the limb, and during the protraction of the left hind limb, we can see a little shift of the weight towards the hind limbs. And then during the stance phase of the left hind limb, the lumbar spine starts swinging to the right. Now let's see what the left forelimb does during the gait cycle. We saw that when the left hind is on the stance phase, this little shift of weight towards the hind limbs. So that's the time when the left forelimb has to protract and to move forward. And we see that it doesn't have enough freedom to do so, because as soon as it lands on the ground, then the right hind will lift off the ground, and then we'll see again that shift of weight towards the forelimbs, and the whole weight of the horse will go through this left forelimb. And we can see that the scapulothoracic movement is very limited, and also that we can see the outline of the bones, and we can see that the shoulder joint between the scapula and the humerus, when the forelimb advances forward, instead of opening the angle and extending, it remains flexed, and so the stride remains short. And because of this inability of the shoulder to move, we see bigger movements from the carpus, the fetlock, from the more distal joints in the forelimb. Now we're going to see the horse walking from the front. Again, we can see that the barrel swings nicely from side to side, but it's more visible on the left side because of the right side bending throughout his spine. We can see that he walks with his head and neck lowered, trying to help offload the hind limbs. And then we can see that at the base of his neck, at the caudal cervical spine, there's still that right side bend. And when he has to turn his head to the left to look at his handler, he does so only from the upper part, from the cranial part of the cervical spine. So we would expect this horse, when ridden, to be difficult to bend properly to the left. Moving to the shoulders, because there's not enough movement in the shoulder joints, he's swinging his shoulders from side to side, following the movement of the rest of his body that we see as the swinging of the barrel from side to side. Now, going more distally, again, we can see the larger movement happening at the level of the carpi because of the lack of movement on the shoulders and the distal limb. And we can also see that the hooves are landing on the lateral side first, and this makes them rotate externally a little bit. And in general, we see that the forelimbs move in line with the hind limbs. However, when the horse turns to the left to look at his handler at some point, then the left leg comes towards the midline because he can't bend to the left through his body. There. And there. And finally, we're going to see the horse move from the right side. We can see the tension in the dorsal neck muscles and the paraspinal muscles on the thoracic and lumbar spine. And it's this tension that maintains the right side bending. And if we take a moment to look at the movement of the right hind, we'll see that throughout the motion, the hock is kept almost straight, so he doesn't bend the hock to advance the hind limb forwards. So in order for the horse to protract that right hind limb, he has to swing and bend his thoracic and lumbar spine and swing his pelvis to the right. And so the whole lateral chain of muscles on the right side would be tense and stiff. And on this side, we can see clearly the right rotation of the thoracic and lumbar spine. And it wouldn't be surprising if we put a saddle on this horse and it kept twisting towards the left side. Also, because of the inability of the hock to bend, there's extension and bending and rotating happening at the lumbar spine to prevent the hoof from touching the ground during the protraction of the hind limb. And if we look at the right shoulder, we can see that the scapulothoracic movement is a bit better on this side, but we can see a lot of tension on the muscles surrounding the shoulder. There's also a bit better extension of the shoulder forwards, but then the forelimb doesn't have enough time to extend more because it has to land to offload the right hind. And the same pattern that we analyzed about the hind limbs, about the antalgic gait and so on, is also happening at the forelimbs as well. So as soon as the left hind limb touches the ground, the right one has to lift, and so the whole weight is gonna tip forwards and transfer onto the left forelimb. So we see that the left forelimb is rushed and it hits the ground with more force and more concussion.